I would first of all like to say a very warm welcome to this particular part of the talk, and to thank you as a department for inviting me to speak and be part of the Organisational Psychology Summer Seminar, because it is part of the calendar that I really look forward to. And although there is a little loss involved in that we're thumbnails and initials on screen as opposed to seeing ourselves together and being able to engage person to person, it's very wonderful to be here. So thank you. As you all know, I, and because of that unexpected, lovely sort of farewell slide from Almuth, I am for now the programme director for coaching psychology, but will shortly be leaving and taking on another role as just a teaching member of the team, but have such a close and warm affiliation with Birkbeck and our department that I hope that will continue. And I would also like to say that we are blessed to have Lilith Wiley taking over as programme director, and she brings so much experience and research, so it will be in wonderful hands. But as Levinson said, all loss is change, all change is loss, and loss must be mourned. So I do pause for a moment and just reflect on the change and the fact that this will be a missed part of my working life. So let's focus now on our session today. For the next half an hour, we are going to linger on the subject of loss and melancholia. The talk will be informed by psychoanalytic thinking, so warmed up to the notion of the unconscious through Simon's wonderful talk. We'll be thinking about eros and thanatos. We'll be thinking about the instinct towards life through eros, and towards destruction, thanatos. And as well as our own experiences of loss at home and at work, and increasingly working with home, we'll be able to bring our own examples of loss to mind as you listen to some of the ideas I'm going to present. So as we rest on loss and endings, I'd like to invite you to reflect on your own experiences over these last long 16 months. In so doing, I'm aware that that might well bring up certain vulnerabilities for you, certain thoughts about your experiences that might be painful, that might be difficult. So I would encourage you to bring to mind those losses, those endings that you can handle in this environment, to operate with self-care. But whether that's the small loss of not being able to go to the theatre or not being able to go to the gym, about missing those informal conversations, of not having space in your work office, not having the opportunity to have informal encounters, losing the chance to see the whole person. Or indeed, it might be a loss about an illness, or the loss of a loved one, or the suffering of colleagues around you. So please take a moment just to hold those losses in your mind. I'd like to allow you to linger longer, but I know we've got short time, so I'll continue. Rochefoucauld famously says that we cannot look directly either at the sun or at death. And the work of Irving Yalom very much embraces this idea that we need to connect with our mortality in order to live full and compassionate lives. And his book, Staring at the Sun, is a wonderful expression of that. It might be said, particularly in Western culture, that we look at death through a filter. And hopefully we've moved beyond the behaviour where we cross the road or turn around very quickly when we see someone who's experienced a loss. but perhaps not that much. And this year, we've been confronted with death on a daily basis. Never has memento mori, remember you will die, felt more prescient. We've thought about whether a hug will endanger the life of loved ones. Will our desire to be connected to another person to person cause harm? We've seen daily death statistics here and around the world. We've had the sight of ICU beds with patients dying alone. We've had the pain of goodbyes over Zoom. We've had the transfer of final tender moments given to nurses and doctors who were strangers weeks before. We've seen temporary morgues in the streets of New York City. We've seen overflowing crematorium in India. And then, as we've referred to in the work of our anti-racist and decolonizing the curriculum thing, we had the terrible sight of George Floyd's death brought to us, an event that we couldn't look away from. This global experience became very personal. So we've all had to deal with losses of different types. Here in our department, there have been painful losses and encounters with life and death. And like everyone else here, there is the loss or ending to process, as well as work and tasks to be done. And sometimes the time to dwell on our loss is denied to us. And this might be a helpful coping mechanism, but it also prevents us from working through the losses, integrating the experience, feeling the pain and acknowledging what this means. So today we're going to linger a little, to think, to reflect, and I'll be using some papers from the very origins and heart of psychoanalysis to help us along the way. We'll be looking at Freud's 1916 paper on transience, where war and the inevitability, the confrontation of death was first brought to mind. We'll be looking at his seminal paper, Mourning and Melancholia, where object relations was introduced, and we'll be breaking down and understanding what the difference between mourning and melancholia are. And we'll be looking at Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the 1920 offering that brought us the notion of the death drive. And interestingly, Simon quoted Eros as the unifying force, and we'll be looking there at the rupture that was caused by the pleasure principle. And then we'll just touch on civilization and its discontent, where we were brought the more aggressive form of the death drive. Now, we're focusing on Freud, but these concepts were built on and developed by many that followed: Klein, Lacan, Zizek, and so many others. So this is not something that is stopping with what we're discussing here. It's a starting point. And you may well wonder, how are papers written over 100 years ago going to be relevant to us today as we grapple with our own clients, our own experiences of loss and disruption and endings in the workplace? And hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll see that they do have a place. I will be showing a few slides later, but I'm going to just share some ideas and then bring some images to the fore, which hopefully connect and bring these century-old ideas very much to our present day experience. But I'd first like to talk a little bit about Mourning and Melancholia and this 1917 paper where Freud, reflects on losses following the First World War. And he introduced the notion of mourning as the healthy capacity to process a painful ending. So it could be a lost object or a person, and he contrasted that with the equally painful but unprocessed loss associated with melancholia. And the loss of an important person or a thing initiates grief, initiates mourning. And if we look at a dictionary definition of that, it almost doesn't distinguish between the two. It's almost as if they're synonymous, and yet they are not the same emotionally. to grieve and experience sorrow that accompanies it is a much more transitory matter than mourning, and indeed melancholia, where we'll see we get stuck. So mourning is a turning away from reality, a connection to the pain of the loss, and mourning and melancholia are triggered by the same events. They create dejection, loss of interest, inability to love, really the inhibition of all activities. And it might be useful just to bring Freud's ideas to a very current example, so you can see how these play out, this difference between what one could call a healthy response to loss in mourning and a pathological response to loss in melancholia. So say, for example, an individual is made redundant from a job they love. This is something that many of those in our circles, in our organisations, we might well have survivor guilt alongside those who are made redundant. Not an uncommon experience. Perhaps it's the only job they've ever had. Perhaps it's something that they thought was going to be their working life, that they would begin and end in this institution. So if one took a response that was a mourning response, the individual would be sad, it would be painful, there might be shame and loss, a loss of income, of face, of a loved routine and pride in work. And the individual acknowledges this pain, but recognises that this is a pain that must be worked through. They need a job. They want continued development. They have more to offer. This is not the end. They have hope in another future. And this mournful response to work is much more akin to the models of loss that you might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and others. Whereas with melancholia, the response is different. It's a pathological response. And note that the similarity in feelings evoked are almost mirrored, shame, loss, loss of income, of face, of routine, of pride. But the difference here is that the individual acknowledges this pain, but can see no end to this. It's not the job that it's lost. It's them as an individual that's lost. They have no more to offer. They have no hope in the future. They blame themselves for the loss. They turn in on themselves. The loss is lodged inside and cannot be dislodged. This is melancholia. And just a reminder, of course, that this is an unconscious process. This is not something we're doing willingly. We're not deciding to get stuck. This is happening through an unconscious process. Perhaps a lighter way of looking at this, we've all experienced the results of the football on Sunday. A loss of sorts that was, as a nation, perhaps something very disappointing. But for those young players, something which could be tackled in a way that will allow them to move forward, having learnt from their disappointment and their loss, but could, for some, cause them to get absolutely stuck in their definition of themselves as a failure, as somebody who's had the weight of the nation on their shoulders and they have let them down. So do they define themselves by their loss, or do they acknowledge this as part of life? And I think Gareth Southgate gave a very interesting reference to time and the importance of that in terms of processing our loss. So we cannot know when we look at an individual where they are in terms of their loss. We can't know how they're processing their experience of bereavement or ending or disruption. And I'd like to bring to mind, although I don't have the image of it, Michael Rosen, who is somebody we're going to turn to again at the end. He wrote the wonderful poem in praise of the NHS, These Are the Hands, and he, many years before all of this, lost a child and wrote a book called Sad. And it's a book that is written for children, but it's written for all of us. And I would really encourage you to dip in to understand loss. He writes beautifully. But one of the images early on in the book is a pen picture of him with an enormous smile on his face. So he's written this book just after he's lost his child. He's writing about sadness, and there he is, beaming. And it's captioned, "This is me looking sad." An indication of the masks we wear and how imperative it is to look below the surface to understand what's really going on. So this first example of what psychoanalytic theory can offer us then is mourning and melancholia. And I'm going to now just move on to talk about something which is slightly more, paradoxical, slightly sticky, that of the death drive. Now, Freud brought us this notion of our relationship to death and endings in his expression of the death drive, and the idea of destruction for destruction's sake. So it's a bit of an enigma. It's both a return to nothingness and a force for destruction. And he first introduced this to us in 1920 in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And this created a real rupture in the psychoanalytic community. Those who followed him before and enjoyed his emphasis on eros, and those who followed after and recognized the value and place of Thanatos. And many did not like this additional emphasis on Thanatos, his idea that the meaning of all life is death. His thinking in this writing was that pleasure, and bear with me here, was really the elimination of excitation, that destruction and the compulsion to repeat builds excitation, thus a paradoxical concept. And many of you may be familiar with the game that Freud observed of his grandson, the Fort Dar game, where he threw the yo-yo out and brought it back again. And Freud observed this and acknowledged the power of the compulsion to repeat, and brought emphasis then to the way we return again and again to painful memories and painful experiences. Here, perhaps, we can see how jouissance can link to this expression of the death drive. Now, he's talking about unconscious expressions of our drives, and it's not something we've necessarily intellectualized or actioned intentionally. But in Civilization and Its Discontent, he added to his thinking on the death drive and brought us the aggression and destruction associated with the more violent elements of the death drive in opposition to the return to nothing. And here he moves from the individual to the systemic. And those familiar with my work during the financial crisis will know that there were some very visceral expressions of the death drive involving the burning of cars, the burning of effigies, the violent behaviour of the community in which the dying organisation was situated, almost a community kind of out for revenge. So I'm going to now ask you to hold those ideas of mourning and melancholia and the death drive in mind while I just pull up some images from different fields to help to connect those to what we're talking about today. And I'm going to hopefully be able to allocate easily. Hang on a second. Try again. I've gone to the OneDrive rather than my computer. Here we are. And when I bring up this image, I'd like to imagine that you're not here online, but you're actually in a gallery, perhaps, looking at this image. If you're perhaps surrounded by a few other people. I don't think that's showing, is it? Oh, here we are. Okay, do we see this as a presentation, or is all the slides?
You can see the slides.
You can see it as an individual slide or the whole thing?
No, just presentation slide 1, Susan, so you're good.
Excellent. Good. Okay, right. So let me first bring to mind a painting which I think all of you will have seen and connected with during however long your lives have been. This is Edvard Munch's The Scream. And here we have a painting that embodies loss. It embodies a sense of loneliness. And this was one of his very first self-portraits. And Edvard Munch painted this image, which has become so iconic in so many ways. Andy Warhol, Tracy Emin refers to it as her favourite historical painting. It somehow captures that sense of loneliness and despair we can all feel internally. That sense of, where do I turn? How do I cope with what's going on in my head? And he painted this incredible portrait when he had just lost his sister Sophie. And she died at 13 years old, and death was very close to Edvard Munch throughout his life. Death and loneliness, and I think that's really present in many of his paintings. So I think that when we see this, we're able to evoke in ourselves the connection to that loneliness, that sense of despair. And interestingly, if we think about the idea of sublimation, the defense mechanism that allows us to process our anxieties and our loss in a way that creates a creative output, this painting, perhaps inspired by his sister's death, Sophie, and also we think of Freud, whose daughter, Sophie, died in 1920, and his publication of The Pleasure Principle in the same year. Interestingly, his daughter Sophie died from the pandemic of the Spanish flu and complications that followed, which somehow pulls at the string of both of our experiences, those of us here emerging from a pandemic now, and Freud in the midst of his own trauma, having lost his daughter. So this is the first self-portrait I wanted to bring you of Edvard Munch, and he's currently showing at the Royal Academy alongside Tracy Emin, and we'll come to her in a minute. But here we have another self-portrait, and this is the last self-portrait that Edvard Munch created. And here he is standing between the clock and the bed. And the bed is, for Edvard Munch, and perhaps for many of us, the place where life begins and the place where life ends. And here he's facing death. You look at his direct stare at us. He's looking at us. He's not fearful. He's not apologetic. It's almost saying, you know, my time is up. I know I'm near the end. And his work is behind him, representing what he's achieved in his life. So one might say that this is an acceptance of the end that's coming. And to connect that to, let me look at the time, just to connect that to Emin, who, as I've said, has got this exhibition together with Munch, and that I think she sees a very strong connection between her work and his. Her presentation of the bed, a place of both death and endings and destruction, and also of life and potential creation. And it feels very poignant that her exhibition emerged at a time when she herself was struggling with life-threatening cancer, which thankfully is now in remission, but she has lost so much physically, and yet has chosen to embrace life and her creativity post her illness with great vigour. I'm going to offer one more image, which brings the death drive to life, I hope. And here we have, you know, an image that I think that we'll all remember. This is the storming of Capitol Hill. This is a crowd reaction to the painful recognition that their chosen messianic leader, their hope for the future that they identified with, along with, of course, some stirring and some encouragement, led to this violent outburst, an outburst that caused chaos in a way that very few of us could imagine happening in the heart of the Capitol, and one which I think very profoundly demonstrates the power of the death drive in action. So I'm going to pause there and stop sharing. Let me just make sure I don't leave you. In addition to stopping sharing this. And I'd like to just ask you to think for a moment about our own collective experience of loss over the past 16 months, and to bring just one final idea, this idea of collective mourning, that perhaps even today, in this very short time, we've come together with an opportunity to think about loss in a way that we perhaps haven't allowed ourselves before. We have been denied so many rituals around mourning during this period. We haven't had a process of containment and holding through this loss. Things have been thrown up in the air and we still don't know how they're going to be landing. And how long do we need to grieve? How long do we need time to think about these things? And I'd like to just finish with a few words from Michael Rosen. This is from one of his books about the many different kinds of love. And he says, "You said that the last night I lay in the bed, struggling to breathe, you thought the shadow of death crossed my face. I remember the line about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, or how the angel of death passes over some and kills others. I'm confused between thankful and sorry. Thankful to be here now, sorry for those who didn't make it. Sorry for you, as I imagine what it felt like to look on that shadow." And I found that so moving and resonated so much, and I hope you too can connect to it, to your own experiences and those of loss that have surrounded us. And I hope that you agree that psychoanalytic thought has something to offer us. And I'll pause there, not necessarily for questions, I don't know whether we have much time, but certainly for your thoughts. I don't know whether I have answers, but I'll pause there. Thank you. Shall I ask Mark?
Thank you so much, Susan, for such a thought-provoking presentation. So everybody, as before, the same thing, you can either pop any questions or comments in the comments box, or I will also keep an eye on the chat. I would just like to give people a little bit of a break, but we certainly have some time for one or two questions. Haha, Mark, I knew you were going to come in on this one. Please, Mark, over to you.
Well, it'd be very rude of me, considering we've had the pleasure of both a Freudian and a Lacanian response this afternoon. We really are very much spoiled. Fantastic, Susan. You know, it's the idea of loss and mourning. And
there we are. We seem to have lost Mark in that process of that question.
I'm back again. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I should be brief. No, I just want to say thank you. And it was more of a reflection, really, because in coming back up into town, and the kind of the sense of loss and lack, which is apparent just by the kind of physicality of coming back into London and Birkbeck itself. It was just, I wanted to add, there's a term which I came across which I think speaks towards what you were saying, Susan. It's a term called kenopsia, which is KENOPSIA, and the description of this is the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually bustling with people, but is now abandoned and quiet. A school hallway in the evening, an unlit office on a weekend, vacant fairgrounds, an emotional afterimage that makes it seem not just empty, but hyper empty, with a total population in the negative, who are so conspicuously absent, they glow like neon signs. And that kind of sense of loss and lack, I think, just went from what I was listening to you and looking at those images and thinking about what's taken place over the last 16 months, really kind of spoke to me. So I just want to say thank you for your thoughts.
Thank That's my pleasure, and thank you for that. Can you please put the word in the chat, because I didn't catch it, and I shall adopt that. Thank you.
So Susan, I'm going to paraphrase a comment here from Steve, which also resonates with me as a manager for all my sins. Of course, in the workplace, we have lost the familiar around us. We have lost predictability, and that has resulted in a loss of confidence. So how do we actually manage to unpack that in the workplace? Where do we start, Susan?
Well, I think that we have much to learn from Gareth Southgate on this matter. I think we have to be gentle with ourselves and give ourselves time to acknowledge that if we haven't been attacked by illness directly, that we are all quite traumatized and have had a very difficult period of very close association with loss. And so I would say to take our time, to be able to ask for help when you need it, to acknowledge that you are perhaps struggling. And I think that hopefully the shift and change that we will experience together in exposing our vulnerabilities will actually help to change the workplace for a better long term as well.
So acknowledging our vulnerability, giving ourselves time, and being kinder to ourselves and to others.
It's a good recipe, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and we've got much to thank you for, Susan, really, to leave us with this message. So thank you. Certainly resonated very deeply with me, and I can see by the comments with everybody else too. Thank you, Susan. And honestly, I take my hat off to you to do all of this without slides and without prompts. That is quite a skill.
It's my favourite subject. So thank you, Alma, for allowing me to talk.